The mist hung like a funeral shroud over the jagged escarpment as Private First Class Desmond Thomas Doss peered over the blood-soaked ridge. The morning of May 5, 1945, dawned with an eerie silence that belied the carnage of the previous day's battle. Captain Jack Glover stood transfixed, his weathered face etched with disbelief as he watched the man he had once tried to have discharged from the Army single-handedly rescuing wounded soldiers under punishing Japanese fire. The same skinny Virginian farm boy whom Glover's men had tormented for years, throwing boots at him while he prayed, calling him a coward, threatening to kill him when combat began, was now risking his own life repeatedly to save theirs. By nightfall, Doss had rescued 75 men, one by one, lowering them down the treacherous cliff face, using nothing but a rope and his own 2 hands. What Captain Glover witnessed that day defied 3 long years of military indoctrination about what constituted courage on the battlefield. The Army had taught them that warriors carried rifles, that bravery meant killing the enemy before they killed you. Yet here was a man who refused to even touch a weapon, who had endured endless ridicule for his religious convictions, now demonstrating a brand of courage that left the battle-hardened soldiers speechless. As the captain watched Doss work tirelessly through the night, he was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The very man he had deemed most unfit for combat had become the greatest hero of the battle for Hacksaw Ridge. The path that led Desmond Doss to that blood-soaked ridge on Okinawa began in the quiet Blue Ridge foothills of Lynchburg, Virginia. Born on February 7, 1919, Doss was raised in a humble, working-class home where the rhythm of life was set by his mother's devout Seventh-day Adventist faith. From childhood, young Desmond absorbed the biblical commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," with a literal conviction that would later put him at odds with the entire United States military establishment. His father, a carpenter and World War I veteran, had returned from that conflict a changed man, haunted by the horrors he had witnessed in the trenches of Europe. The framed photograph of fallen local soldiers that hung in the Lynchburg courthouse made a profound impression on young Desmond, cementing his pacifist beliefs even as the world again marched toward global conflict. By 1941, as war clouds gathered over the Pacific and Atlantic, Doss was working at the Newport News Naval Shipyard. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, patriotic fervor swept the nation. Young men rushed to recruiting offices, eager to avenge the attack. Doss felt the same patriotic pull, but his conscience would not allow him to take human life. He could have claimed exemption from military service as a defense industry worker or religious conscientious objector, but something deeper drove him. "I felt like it was an honor to serve my country," he would later explain, "according to the dictates of my conscience." When Doss enlisted in April 1942, he registered as a conscientious cooperator, believing he could serve as a medic without carrying a weapon. The United States Army had a different perspective. To military minds shaped by the brutal realities of modern warfare, a soldier who refused to bear arms was not merely an oddity, he was a liability, a potential threat to unit cohesion and survival. The Army's training system was designed to transform civilians into killers, to overcome the natural human reluctance to take another life. Doss represented a direct challenge to this fundamental military doctrine, and the system responded with predictable hostility. The scale of persecution Doss faced during basic training exceeded mere hazing or typical military rigor. His fellow soldiers viewed his religious convictions as cowardice masquerading as conscience. They threw boots at him while he knelt in prayer beside his bunk. They cursed him, ostracized him, and placed bets on how quickly he would crack under combat conditions. One soldier directly threatened him, saying, "Doss, when we get into combat, I'll make sure you don't come back alive." His commanding officers were equally determined to remove him from service. They assigned him to unnecessary duties on Saturdays, knowing he observed the Sabbath. When he refused, they threatened court-martial. They attempted to have him discharged for mental instability. When psychological evaluations found him perfectly sane, they increased the pressure, hoping he would simply quit. The persecution reached its zenith when Captain Glover, his company commander, tried to have him transferred out of combat duty. "I cannot trust the lives of my men to a man who won't even defend himself," Glover argued. The depth of animosity toward Doss reflected more than personal dislike. It represented a fundamental clash between military necessity and individual conscience. In a world at war, where entire nations mobilized for total conflict, there seemed no place for a man who refused to kill. Yet when all attempts to remove him failed, the Army reluctantly allowed Doss to serve as a combat medic. No one, including his fellow soldiers, expected him to survive the crucible of combat. The global conflict that engulfed Desmond Doss and millions of other Americans was unprecedented in its scale and brutality. By 1944, the United States was fully engaged in a two-front war against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The American industrial machine had achieved production levels that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft compared to Japan's 28,000. U.S. shipyards launched 8 million tons of shipping, while Japan managed only 1.7 million. American factories rolled out over 17,000 tanks, while German production struggled to match half that number despite Albert Speer's desperate attempts to increase output. These cold statistics translated to overwhelming advantages on the battlefield, yet the human cost remained staggering. By mid-1944, American casualties were approaching 250,000. In the Pacific Theater, where Doss would soon find himself, the fighting took on a particularly savage character. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated in the Bushido code that glorified death over surrender, fought with a fanatical determination that shocked American forces. Islands like Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu became synonymous with carnage as Marines and Army units paid in blood for every yard of coral and jungle. It was against this backdrop that Private First Class Doss joined the 77th Infantry Division, known as the Statue of Liberty Division, as a combat medic assigned to Company B, 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment. His unit had already seen bitter fighting in Guam and Leyte in the Philippines before they were ordered to join the invasion of Okinawa in the spring of 1945. Okinawa represented the last major obstacle before a planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. Military planners estimated that conquering this heavily fortified island would cost 10,000 American lives. The actual toll would exceed 12,000 dead and over 36,000 wounded. For the Japanese, Okinawa represented the inner defensive perimeter to be defended at all costs. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and Okinawan conscripts prepared elaborate defensive positions, with particular attention paid to the imposing Maeda Escarpment that divided the island. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, planned a war of attrition, hoping to inflict such severe casualties that America would reconsider invading Japan itself. His forces converted the escarpment, soon dubbed Hacksaw Ridge by American troops, into a virtually impregnable fortress, with interlocking fields of fire, hidden artillery positions, and a maze of tunnels and bunkers that allowed defenders to appear seemingly out of nowhere. American propaganda had portrayed the Japanese as fanatical, subhuman enemies, yellow monkeys, in the crude racial terminology of wartime America. Training films and posters emphasized their supposed cruelty and treachery, reinforcing the dehumanization necessary to overcome natural reluctance to kill. Such propaganda served a dual purpose, motivating American soldiers to fight while justifying the increasingly brutal nature of the Pacific War. By the time Doss and the 77th Division landed on Okinawa, many American soldiers believed the only good Japanese soldier was a dead one. The dehumanization worked in both directions. Japanese propaganda portrayed Americans as bloodthirsty devils intent on destroying Japanese culture and enslaving its people. The indoctrination Doss's fellow soldiers received left no room for conscientious objection. To them, refusing to kill the enemy meant endangering your comrades, a betrayal of the brotherhood forged in training and tempered in combat. As one officer put it, a man who won't kill won't fight, and a man who won't fight is worthless to his unit. This mindset made Doss an object of suspicion and contempt even as the 77th Division began its bloody campaign on Okinawa in April 1945. The American landing on Okinawa began on Easter Sunday, April 1, 1945. The initial landings met unexpectedly light resistance, leading some optimistic commanders to hope the island might be taken quickly. This hope proved tragically misplaced. General Ushijima had withdrawn his forces to heavily fortified positions in the southern third of the island, where the terrain favored defense. As American forces pushed south, they encountered increasingly fanatical resistance. By late April, the advance had slowed to a bloody crawl. For Doss, the landings marked his third major combat operation. On Guam and Leyte, he had already demonstrated unusual bravery, earning a Bronze Star with V device for valor on each island. On Guam, he had advanced through heavy enemy fire to treat a wounded soldier in an exposed position, remaining with the injured man for 5 hours until darkness allowed evacuation. On Leyte, he had treated 4 men who had been cut down crossing a field, dragging each to safety despite constant sniper fire. These actions had begun to change some of his unit's perceptions of him. The same men who had tormented him now grudgingly acknowledged his courage, though many still considered his refusal to carry a weapon a dangerous liability. Sergeant Howell, who had been one of Doss's cruelest tormentors during training, watched with grudging respect as the medic worked tirelessly treating wounded men during the advance south. "I still think you're crazy for not carrying a weapon," he told Doss one evening as they huddled in a muddy foxhole, "but I'm damn glad you're with us." Other soldiers remained openly hostile, however. Private Wilson, whose brother had been killed on Peleliu, still refused to speak to Doss, considering his pacifism an insult to those who fought and died. The true test came on April 29, 1945, when the 77th Division encountered the Maida Escarpment. Rising 400 feet above the surrounding terrain, with the last 50 feet a nearly vertical cliff face, the escarpment presented a formidable obstacle. The Japanese had fortified the ridge with dozens of machine gun nests, mortar positions, and artillery pieces, all carefully sited to create interlocking fields of fire. The only approach was up cargo nets thrown over the cliff face, a near-suicidal climb under the best circumstances, let alone under enemy fire. The first assault by A Company ended in disaster. Of the 155 men who attempted the climb, only 45 returned unwounded. The remainder lay dead or injured on the ridgetop, or had fallen to their deaths during the desperate retreat. For 2 days, the wounded lay exposed to enemy fire, their cries for help clearly audible to the men below. Several medics attempted rescues, but none could reach the ridgetop through the withering fire. The battalion commander reluctantly concluded that no more men could be risked in rescue attempts. The wounded would have to wait until the ridge was taken. On May 2nd, a second assault was ordered. This time, B Company, including Doss, would lead the attack. The night before, Lieutenant Garanto gathered the men for a final briefing. When he finished outlining the attack plan, he asked if there were any questions. Doss raised his hand and suggested that perhaps the men might want to pray before attempting the ridge. The lieutenant, surprising many, agreed. "Doss," he said, "why don't you lead us in prayer?" The medic, uncomfortable with public prayer, hesitated before offering a simple petition for protection and courage. Several men bowed their heads. Others stared stonily ahead. Private Wilson spat on the ground and muttered an obscenity. Yet something in the quiet sincerity of Doss's prayer touched even some of the hardened veterans. Sergeant Howell, later confessed he had prayed along silently, though he would rather have died than admit it at the time. At dawn on May 2nd, B Company began their ascent. Japanese mortars and machine guns opened up as the first men reached the cargo nets. The air filled with the distinctive chatter of Japanese Nambu machine guns and the crack of Arisaka rifles. Men fell from the nets like broken dolls, their bodies tumbling down the cliff face. Others reached the top only to be cut down by hidden enemy positions. Doss climbed amid the chaos, his aid bag bouncing against his hip, his only protection, the Red Cross emblem on his helmet, an emblem he had actually removed. Knowing that Japanese snipers specifically targeted medics, what happened over the next 3 days transformed the relationship between Doss and his unit forever. As men fell wounded atop the ridge, Doss crawled from position to position, treating injuries under constant enemy fire. When stretcher-bearers couldn't reach the most exposed positions, he dragged wounded men to safety himself, seemingly oblivious to the bullets kicking up dirt around him. Japanese soldiers, spotting the unarmed medic's movements, concentrated their fire on him, yet somehow he remained unscathed. After one particularly daring rescue, Sergeant Howell grabbed him by the shoulders. "Doss, are you crazy or just plain stupid? How are you still alive?" The medic just smiled. "I just asked the Lord to help me get one more," he replied simply. By the third day on the ridge, May 4th, American forces had established a tenuous foothold, but the fighting remained desperate. Japanese counterattacks came in waves, with suicide charges often preceding larger coordinated assaults. During one such attack, a Japanese soldier threw a grenade that wounded 3 men in a forward position. Without hesitation, Doss crawled forward under covering fire, treated all 3 men, and dragged them one by one to a sheltered depression. As he worked on the 3rd man, an enemy machine gun opened up, pinning them down. For 4 hours, Doss sheltered with the wounded soldier, applying pressure to a severed artery, until darkness allowed them to crawl back to American lines. Such actions began to transform the unit's perception of courage. Men who had mocked Doss's refusal to carry a weapon now watched in awe as he demonstrated a different kind of bravery. Not the adrenaline-fueled courage of combat, but a steady, conscious decision to place himself in danger to save others. Even Private Wilson grudgingly nodded to Doss when they passed each other in the makeshift aid station behind the lines. "Oh, you did good up there," he admitted, the closest thing to praise he had ever offered the medic. The defining moment came on May 5, 1945. After a brutal Japanese artillery barrage, American forces were ordered to fall back from their positions atop the ridge. In the chaos of the retreat, dozens of wounded men were left behind. Rather than descend with the others, Doss remained atop the ridge, alone except for the wounded and the enemy. What followed would later be described by war correspondents as one of the most extraordinary acts of heroism in American military history. Working methodically through enemy fire, Doss located wounded men, treated their most serious injuries, then carried or dragged them to the edge of the cliff. There he constructed a rudimentary rope litter system, using a tree stump as an anchor point. One by one, he lowered the injured men down the sheer cliff face to safety, returning each time into the maelstrom of Japanese fire to find another wounded soldier. Between each rescue, he prayed the same simple prayer: "Lord, please help me get just one more." The men of B Company, watching from below, could scarcely believe what they were witnessing. The same skinny Virginian they had tormented and threatened was now risking his life repeatedly to save theirs. By nightfall, Doss had single-handedly rescued 75 men, including some of his worst tormentors. Private Wilson was among them, his leg shattered by machine gun fire. As Doss prepared to lower him down the cliff, Wilson grabbed his arm. "I never thought I'd be saying this," he admitted, through pain-clenched teeth, "but I'm praying too now. Praying you get us all out alive." Captain Glover, watching the rescue operation from the command post below, turned to his executive officer. "Do you know how I tried to run Doss out of my company? How I told him he didn't belong in the Army?" The officer nodded. Well, Glover continued, his voice thick with emotion, I have never been so wrong about anyone in my life. The statistical improbability of Doss's feat becomes clear when considering the tactical situation on Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese had emplaced more than 50 machine guns covering the American positions, each capable of firing up to 500 rounds per minute. Artillery pieces lobbed shells at a rate of 20 to 30 per hour. Snipers occupied camouflaged positions, specifically targeting American officers and medics. By any rational military calculation, a single unarmed man moving repeatedly across exposed terrain should have been killed within minutes. But Doss accomplished his mission for over 12 consecutive hours, defied comprehension. Military historians would later analyze the Hacksaw Ridge action in detail. They concluded that Doss moved more than 1,000 yards under direct fire, was directly targeted at least 20 times by machine gun bursts, and evaded no fewer than 15 mortar shells that landed within 20 feet of his position. He carried or dragged men weighing between 140 and 200 pounds over rough terrain, while himself weighing only 150 pounds. The total weight he transported that day exceeded 5,000 pounds. Each time he lowered a man down the cliff face, he had to overcome not only the weight, but also the technical challenge of controlling the descent. The physical endurance required, even without considering the extreme stress of combat, would have exhausted most trained athletes. Japanese accounts recovered after the war added another dimension to the story. Lieutenant Ito Masahiro, commanding a machine gun section on the ridge, wrote in his diary about an American medic who seemed impervious to fire. We targeted the American many times, but he continues his work as if protected by some power. The men begin to whisper that he is protected by their Christian God. I have ordered them to stop such talk, but I confess the side effects even my own resolve. The impact of Doss's actions extended beyond the 75 men he physically saved. Witnesses described a transformation in unit morale that defied measurement. Men who had been on the verge of breaking under the strain of combat found new reserves of courage. If Doss can do what he did without a weapon, one sergeant told his squad, we damn sure can keep fighting with ours. The psychological effect cascaded through the entire battalion, contributing to a renewed offensive that ultimately secured the ridge permanently on May 6th. Sergeant Howell, who had once thrown his boots at the praying private, later admitted, we called him a coward because he wouldn't kill, but we were too blind to see that it takes more courage to go into battle without a weapon than with one. Private Thomas, who had led many of the harassment campaigns during basic training, put it more bluntly, I would rather have Doss with me, unarmed, than any other soldier with a stack of ammunition. The transformation was perhaps most profound. For Captain Glover, or the men who had bullied Doss throughout training and deployment, the experience forced a profound re-evaluation of their understanding of courage. The officer who had tried repeatedly to have Doss transferred or discharged now found himself recommending his former problem soldier for the Medal of Honor. In his official statement supporting the recommendation, Glover wrote, I had judged this man as unfit for combat based on standards that, I now realize, measured only a fraction of what constitutes true courage and value to a fighting unit. Private Doss has demonstrated a brand of bravery that makes the rest of us humble by comparison. The battle for Hacksaw Ridge continued for several more days, with American forces finally securing the position by May 10th. The fighting on Okinawa would drag on for nearly 2 more months, becoming one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War. For Doss, the ordeal was far from over. He continued to serve as a medic until May 21st, when his luck finally ran out. During a night attack, a Japanese grenade landed in the foxhole Doss shared with 2 riflemen. The explosion wounded all 3 men, with Doss taking 17 pieces of shrapnel in his legs. Rather than call for another medic, he treated his own wounds and waited for 5 hours until stretcher-bearers could reach him safely. While being carried to an aid station, he noticed another wounded soldier nearby. Doss insisted the stretcher-bearers take the other man first, rolling off the stretcher despite his injuries. As he crawled toward the aid station, a Japanese sniper shot him, shattering his left arm. Doss improvised a splint using a rifle stock, ironically the first time he had touched a rifle during the entire war. He then crawled 300 yards to safety, his trail marked by blood. At the field hospital, doctors were astounded that he had survived. One physician examined his wounds and remarked, "How in the hell are you still alive?" Doss's quiet reply became legendary among the medical staff. "I know who was with me. It just wasn't my time." The contrast between Doss's treatment before and after Hacksaw Ridge could not have been more stark. The same men who had tormented him now treated him with reverence, bordering on awe. When he was evacuated from Okinawa aboard the hospital ship Mercy, his entire company lined the road to the dock, standing at attention as he passed. Many openly wept. Captain Glover saluted him and said simply, "You have changed us all." During his evacuation, another poignant moment underscored his transformation from outcast to hero. As corpsmen carried Doss aboard the hospital ship, they passed a wounded Japanese prisoner also being evacuated. The man spat at the passing Americans. Without hesitation, Doss asked his bearers to stop. He fumbled in his pocket with his good hand and extracted a chocolate bar from his rations. He handed it to the Japanese soldier with a nod. The interpreters present reported that the enemy soldier asked why an American would show kindness to his enemy. When told of Doss's actions on Hacksaw Ridge, the Japanese soldier bowed his head and wept. The statistical toll of Okinawa stands as testimony to its savagery. American forces suffered 12,000 killed and 36,000 wounded. Japanese military deaths exceeded 100,000, with perhaps another 100,000 Okinawan civilians perishing in the crossfire. Of the 36 original members of Doss's platoon who landed on Okinawa, only 7 remained unwounded by the campaign's end. 4 of those 7 later credited their survival directly to Doss's actions. For Doss himself, the physical cost was severe. The 17 pieces of shrapnel in his legs and the shattered arm left him with permanent disabilities. Complications from his wounds led to tuberculosis, which eventually required the removal of 1 lung and 5 ribs. Yet the psychological impact of his experiences manifested differently than for many veterans. While thousands returned with what was then called combat fatigue or shell shock, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, Doss exhibited remarkable psychological resilience. Dr. Michael Friedman, who treated Doss at a veterans hospital in 1946, noted this anomaly in his medical records. Despite exposure to combat conditions that have produced severe psychological trauma in other patients, Doss shows no significant signs of anxiety, nightmares, or flashbacks. When questioned about this apparent immunity to combat stress, he attributes it to his faith and his clear conscience regarding his actions during the war. The contrast between Doss's mental state and that of many combat veterans, including those who had tormented him, became increasingly apparent during post-war reunions. Sergeant Howell, who had led much of the harassment during training, struggled with alcoholism and recurring nightmares after the war. At a division reunion in 1955, he sought out Doss and made a confession. "I can't sleep without seeing the faces of men I killed. But you only saved lives. I think that's why you can still smile." Doss's transformation from reviled, conscientious objector to celebrated hero reached its official culmination on October 12, 1945, when President Harry Truman presented him with the Medal of Honor in a White House ceremony. As Truman draped the medal around Doss's neck, he departed from the usual formal remarks. Looking the former medic in the eyes, the president said, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." The comment, reported widely in newspapers, highlighted the extraordinary nature of Doss's achievement. The official citation for Doss's Medal of Honor described his actions on Hacksaw Ridge in straightforward military language, but even the terse prose could not disguise the magnitude of his accomplishment. The final paragraph noted, "Through his outstanding bravery and unflinching determination in the face of desperately dangerous conditions, PFC. Doss saved the lives of many soldiers. His name became a symbol throughout the 77th Infantry Division for outstanding gallantry, far above and beyond the call of duty. What the citation could not capture was the profound psychological transformation Doss had triggered in his former tormentors. For many of them, the experience of witnessing his moral courage forced a fundamental reassessment of their own values and beliefs. Private Wilson, who had been among Doss's cruelest bullies, later became a conscientious objector himself, citing Doss as his inspiration. "I used to think courage meant killing the other guy before he killed you," Wilson explained at a veterans gathering in 1952. "Doss showed me it actually takes more guts to save a life than to take one." Captain Glover's transformation was equally profound. After the war, he left the military and became a minister, frequently citing Doss's example in his sermons. In a letter to Doss in 1958, Glover wrote, "You taught me that my definition of strength was fundamentally flawed. I had equated it with domination and violence. You showed me it actually flows from moral conviction and selfless love. This understanding has reshaped my entire life." Perhaps the most remarkable testimony came from Japanese soldiers who learned of Doss's actions. Lieutenant Ito Masahiro, the machine gunner who had written about the seemingly invulnerable American medic, survived the war and eventually corresponded with Doss in the 1960s. "In our military training, we were taught that Americans were devils without honor," he wrote. "Your actions that day forced me to question everything I had been taught. A devil does not risk his life to save his enemies." For Doss himself, the attention and acclaim sat uncomfortably on his shoulders. He consistently deflected praise, insisting he had simply done his duty according to his conscience. When asked about his heroism, he would typically respond, "The real heroes are those who gave their lives. I just helped the wounded. That's all." This humility further endeared him to his former comrades, who now saw in it not weakness, but the same quiet strength that had sustained him through their abuse. The statistical improbability of Doss's survival became a frequent topic among veterans and military historians. Colonel Walter Telford, a military statistician who analyzed combat survival rates, concluded that Doss had faced odds of approximately 1 in 900,000 of surviving his actions on Hacksaw Ridge. "By every mathematical model we apply to combat situations," Telford wrote in a 1962 analysis, "Doss should have been killed multiple times over. That he survived to rescue 75 men defies statistical explanation." For many of the men Doss saved, the mathematical impossibility of his achievement became evidence of divine intervention. Corporal Henry Mills, whom Doss had rescued after both his legs were shattered by machine gun fire, expressed this sentiment at a veterans reunion. "I'm not a religious man, but what happened on that ridge wasn't natural. I saw Doss walk through fire that would have cut anyone else to ribbons. If that ain't a miracle, I don't know what is." The transformation extended beyond Doss's immediate comrades to broader military culture. His example challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between killing and courage that had dominated military thinking for generations. General Omar Bradley, who heard of Doss's actions, later incorporated the story into training materials for officers, noting, "We must expand our definition of valor to include those who save lives with the same reverence we award those who take them in defense of our nation." In the years following the war, Doss's story began to reshape public perception of conscientious objectors. Before Hacksaw Ridge, conscientious objectors were widely regarded as cowards, seeking to avoid the hardships and dangers of military service. Doss's example offered a powerful counter-narrative. One could oppose killing on principle, while still serving with extraordinary courage. The number of conscientious objectors who chose to serve as medics increased significantly in subsequent conflicts, with many citing Doss's example as their inspiration. Doss's post-war life reflected the same quiet humility that had sustained him through his ordeal. Despite his disabilities, he ultimately lost a lung to tuberculosis, contracted during the war, and spent 5 years in hospitals. He built a small home with his own hands in Rising Fawn, Georgia. He and his wife Dorothy raised their son, Desmond Jr., who would later follow his father's footsteps by becoming a conscientious objector, serving as a medic during the Vietnam War. For the men whose lives Doss had saved, the impact extended across generations. Jim Cannon, rescued from atop Hacksaw Ridge with a severed artery that would have killed him within minutes without Doss's intervention, brought his children and later his grandchildren to visit the former medic. "This is the man who is the reason you exist," he would tell them. "Without him, I would have died on that ridge, and none of you would ever have been born." By 1970, Doss's family of rescued soldiers and their descendants numbered more than 400 individuals. The most poignant evidence of transformation came from those who had once been Doss's most vicious tormentors. In 1969, Sergeant Howell, by then suffering from terminal cancer, made a pilgrimage to Doss's home. According to witnesses, the former sergeant knelt before the man he had once persecuted and asked for forgiveness. "You had the strength I only pretended to have, Rin," he said. "I was so wrong about everything." Doss, true to character, embraced the dying man and told him there was nothing to forgive. Over the decades following the war, military historians and psychologists continued to study the Hacksaw Ridge phenomenon as a case study in moral courage and its impact on group psychology. Dr. Elizabeth Harmon, a military psychologist who interviewed dozens of veterans from Doss's unit in the 1970s, identified what she called the Doss effect, the profound psychological transformation that occurs when individuals witness moral courage that contradicts their preconceptions. "What makes the Doss case so remarkable," Dr. Harmon wrote, "is not just the physical courage he displayed, which was extraordinary by any standard, but the way his example forced others to confront their own moral assumptions. Men who had equated courage exclusively with violence were confronted with irrefutable evidence that their framework was incomplete. The cognitive dissonance this created led to genuine psychological transformation in many cases. The statistical evidence for this transformation appeared in follow-up studies of veterans from Doss's unit. Compared to other combat units with similar combat exposure, veterans who served with Doss showed significantly lower rates of alcoholism, domestic violence, and suicide in the decades following the war. Dr. Harmon attributed this difference directly to what she called the moral recalibration, triggered by witnessing Doss's example. These men had been forced to confront the limitations of their value system under the most extreme circumstances imaginable, she noted. Having revised their understanding of courage and strength, they were better equipped to handle post-war adjustment. For Japanese veterans who learned of Doss's story, the impact was equally profound. In 1982, a delegation of former Japanese soldiers who had fought on Okinawa traveled to the United States specifically to meet Doss. Their spokesman, Captain Tanaka Shinji, explained their purpose. "We were taught that Americans were savages who valued only material wealth and physical domination. The story of this American who refused to kill, yet showed such courage, has haunted many of us for years. We needed to see for ourselves the man who contradicted everything we had been told about our enemy." The meeting between Doss and his former enemies embodied the ultimate transformation from hatred to reconciliation. Through an interpreter, Captain Tanaka asked Doss why he had risked his life for men who had tormented him. Doss's answer, delivered with characteristic simplicity, moved several of the Japanese veterans to tears, "because that's what you do for your brothers, even when they don't understand you, and in war, in the end, we're all brothers." In 1990, 45 years after the Battle of Hacksaw Ridge, the Japanese and American governments cooperated to place a joint memorial at the site. The bronze plaque, inscribed in both English and Japanese, commemorates not only the battle but specifically Doss's actions. On this ridge, Private First Class Desmond Thomas Doss, without weapons, rescued 75 men under fire. His actions remind us that even in our darkest hours, our shared humanity transcends the divisions of war. The memorial stands as a powerful symbol of reconciliation, visited by thousands of Japanese and American citizens each year. For the American military, the legacy of Desmond Doss prompted institutional changes that would have been unimaginable before his example. Training protocols for medical personnel were revised to incorporate his techniques. The Military Chaplains Association established the Desmond Doss Award for service members who demonstrated exceptional moral courage. Perhaps most significantly, the stigma associated with conscientious objector status gradually diminished, with military leaders acknowledging that such individuals could make valuable contributions to the armed forces. In 2004, documentary filmmaker Terry Benedict released The Conscientious Objector, bringing Doss's story to a new generation. During filming, Benedict interviewed more than 40 veterans who had served with Doss. Their testimonies revealed the lasting impact of his example. One veteran, his voice breaking with emotion, summarized the transformation. "I went into that war thinking I knew what made a man strong. Doss turned everything I believed upside down. He saved not just my life on that ridge, but my soul afterward." When Desmond Doss died on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87, his funeral was attended not only by fellow veterans and government officials, but also by descendants of men he had rescued, generations of individuals whose very existence testified to the ripple effect of his actions. Among the mourners were 3 Japanese veterans who had fought against him on Okinawa, come to pay their respects to a man who had transformed their understanding of their former enemy. The final measurement of Doss's impact transcends statistics and medals. Perhaps the most profound testimony came from Captain Glover, the officer who had tried so hard to remove Doss from military service. In his final letter to Doss before his own death in 1994, Glover wrote, "You showed us that the strongest man on the battlefield was the one who refused to hate. The miracle of Hacksaw Ridge wasn't just that one unarmed man saved 75 others. The true miracle was that your example changed who we were as men. You made us question our assumptions about strength and weakness, courage and cowardice, friend and enemy. In saving our bodies, you also saved something in our souls." As the sun sets over the now peaceful ridges of Okinawa, the legacy of Desmond Thomas Doss continues to challenge our understanding of courage and conscience. The skinny medic from Virginia, once derided as a coward because he refused to kill, ultimately demonstrated that the highest form of bravery lies not in taking lives, but in saving them, even at the risk of your own, even when those you save once persecuted you. His story stands as a powerful reminder that true strength often appears in the places we least expect to find it, and that a single individual's moral courage can transform not only the lives they touch directly, but echo across generations and former battle lines, healing wounds that weapons only deepen.